Hi there. Thanks for stopping by. Are you curious about Hermeneutic Phenomenological Inquiry? Let's see what we can learn about this research methodology. Let me start by asking you a simple question. How long is 1 hour? If your answer is 60 minutes, I will say that's an answer from the empirical perspective. If you tell me 1 hour feels shorter on the beach than at work, you have just expressed a phenomenological perspective. In a nutshell, phenomenology is the study of human consciousness, particularly how we experience one way versus the other. Phenomenology is less concerned about the objective truth, but rather how humans perceive the objective truth around us. Want to know more? Let's take a look at the history of phenomenology. The philosophical movement of phenomenology bloomed in the early 20th century, led by German philosopher and mathematician Edmund Husserl. Husserl found the prevalent natural science at his time didn't offer a way to study human subjective consciousness, namely why we feel what we feel and do what we do. Husserl noticed the natural scientists' study on human consciousness stemmed from their focus on the objective aspects, for example, our nervous systems and biological compositions, and how they impact our memory, behavior, and perception. This is, of course, what we call neuroscience today. Husserl noted the natural science approach was insufficient at understanding the complexity of our daily experiences. Husserl was interested in understanding why we do what we do every day and why we feel what we feel at different times. These aspects of our lives are what Husserl called the lived experience. Lived experience can only be studied within the flow of natural life experiences. It's important to understand that the lived experience phenomenology studies are the everyday lived experience. It's different from the experience observed in a controlled lab. As such, phenomenology can be used in researching human experiences in psychology, sociology, and education. For example, how a certain demographic group of students view schools or a learning program, and how employees in an organization view their work environment. It is important to note there are two important yet distinctive approaches in phenomenology. The first one is Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. The second approach was developed by Husserl's student Heidegger, called Hermeneutic Phenomenology, also known as interpretive phenomenology. The word transcendental means outwardly. In a way, Husserl's transcendental phenomenology demands the researchers to look at a phenomenon as if they are looking from a different world with no prior knowledge, preconceptions, or biases towards the subject being studied. By standing apart from the phenomenon, the researcher's role is to bracket out all their biases and presumptions and to describe objectively. As Husserl put it, phenomenology is the objective study of human subjectivity. The word hermeneutics refers to the interpretation of texts. This was developed from the need to translate important literature from one language to another, or the need to interpret literature that was produced hundreds or thousands of years ago, such as the Bible. Heidegger began his career in theology, in which hermeneutics was routinely practiced. When he moved into philosophy as a student of Husserl, he brought the practice of hermeneutics into phenomenology. In hermeneutic phenomenology, scholars read the narrative data collected from the studied participants, construct a vague understanding, engage in reflective writing, then re-engage with the texts with revised understanding. In circles of reading and writing, the hermeneutic researchers construct an understanding of the lived experience. Another key aspect that distinguishes hermeneutic phenomenology is the role of the researcher in the inquiry. Instead of bracketing off the researcher's subjective presumptions, hermeneutic phenomenology recognizes that the researcher, like the research subject, cannot be rid of his or her own experiences. Instead, the researcher's past experience and knowledge are valuable guides to the inquiry. Researchers working from hermeneutic phenomenological tradition should openly acknowledge their preconceptions and reflect on how their subjectivity is part of the analysis process. For example, how will the person being studied respond to the researcher given the researcher's cultural, racial, and economic background? Despite the differences in phenomenological approaches, there are several common fundamental assumptions. Number one, human consciousness is the most important aspect of human life. This is pretty straightforward to understand, since phenomenology studies nothing but human consciousness, namely how humans feel, think, remember, imagine, perceive, and make decisions. Subjectivity and objectivity cannot be separated. Unlike the view of a positivist scientist, a phenomenological researcher thinks the objective world and human subjective mind are intrinsically connected. For example, when an individual thinks of an hour, the phenomenological researcher is interested in knowing how an individual subjectively interprets the objective truth of an hour, namely why some people feel an hour is short while others think it's too long. Phenomenological researchers think the experience of all human beings is partially the product of the culture in which the experience takes place. Human experience, on the other hand, further defines or disrupts culture. No human experience should be studied out of its cultural contexts. By now, we should know that phenomenology can help researchers learn about the complex experience of others. It can be a powerful tool to understand subjective experience, gain insights into people's motivations and actions, and cut through the clutter of take-for-granted assumptions and conventional wisdom. For example, phenomenology can be used to study an organizational culture, classroom experience, or how a social or educational program is perceived by the stakeholders. In my paper, I had elaborated a study conducted using the phenomenological approach. The goal of the study is to investigate and understand how teachers are utilizing digital models at schools in Sweden. The authors of the study viewed the teachers' choices and practices of using digital models in teaching a complex phenomenon constituting intertwining subjects, objects, and interactions. As a result, phenomenological inquiry was a suitable approach. The study adopted the typical methods used in phenomenology, which is in-depth personal interviews. These rich and dynamic dialogues provided deep understanding to a phenomenon that was not understood before. If you're like me, a post-positivist thinker or researcher, your go-to way of knowing is perhaps an empiricism-based approach. In an empirical study, your purpose is to prove or test the validity of a hypothesis. Your experiment to test such hypothesis tends to be controlled and structured. In other words, you can typically repeat the study again and again in order to achieve longitudinal data and verification. The larger the data set, the more convincing your conclusion becomes. Both quantitative and qualitative data are utilized. However, as I have come to realize, empirical studies cannot achieve all research goals, especially when it comes to understand complex, volatile human experiences. Not every research is designed to validify. Sometimes the goal is to better understand, especially from others' perspectives. This is when phenomenology comes in, especially hermeneutic phenomenology, which relies on the participants' own narrative to help the researchers to understand their perspectives. In contrast to empiricism, the purpose of phenomenology is to interpret and understand lived experience. It studies everyday and unstructured phenomena. Cultural contexts surrounding the subject should be incorporated into the study. The size of the data is not as important as the depths of each data entry. This is why the in-depth personal interview isn't a signature research method for phenomenology. Also, only qualitative data are utilized. As a pragmatist researcher, I believe researches are to be conducted to solve problems. Empirical approach and phenomenological approach are both powerful tools in research, depending on the purpose of the study. I hope you've learned something interesting about phenomenology as a research methodology. Thanks for taking the journey with me.